MP for Oxford West and Abingdon. I always get that wrong, don't I? And you are the Shadow Foreign Affairs spokesperson too. Got that right, haven't I? Adam Bienkov is Chief Westminster Correspondent for Byline Times. Welcome to you. On my left, we have Christian Wakeford, who's a Conservative MP for Bury South. And we have Wes Streeting with us too, the new Shadow Health Secretary for the Labour Party, only appointed, was it last week or the week before?
It feels like a lot longer ago.
It's been a bit of a baptism of fire, but we'll come to that in a moment. And we have the former Health Minister, Edwina Currie, joining us live from Derbyshire. So they're going to be taking your questions over the next hour. 0345 6060 973. I can imagine that most of the questions will revolve around one or two subjects, but you ask what you want. 0345 6060 973. And you can watch us on Global Player on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk or the LBC YouTube and Facebook channels.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's get straight into it with George in Troon. George, hi, what would you like to ask?
Well, I would like to ask, as a Conservative voter in Scotland, and mind you, that's only something I admit to amongst very close friends, because we're becoming less popular in Scotland. I'm a lifetime Conservative voter, but every time Boris Johnson comes to Scotland, the support for independence goes up. The man is a fool. I've always thought that this is not something new. Macron calling him a clown just recently was accurate, though I have no time for Macron. So I'm fearful that for the Conservative Party, that this man is going to lead us, because he's always been this way.
George, I hear you, but I need a question.
Well, the question is it time for him to get to pack it in so we can get a new Prime Minister who will save the Conservative Party and save the Union?
Edwina Currie, you've been through a fair few party leaders in your time in the Conservative Party. What's your answer to George?
I'm not sure about the way you quite put that, Iain. There you go.
That was your inference, Edwina. I meant nothing by it.
George, I feel for you in Scotland, but perhaps if you were able to tell people you were Conservative, you'd find there were others like you, and it's always a good thing to do that. No, I don't think we should be forever chopping and changing Prime Ministers. You want a perfect saint. Well, in some ways we had one in the last Prime Minister, but didn't actually get anything done. In the end, you've got to have leaders who can be effective and can make things happen. And I think, especially when you look at the way the vaccine rollout has happened, the way the vaccine development happened in this country, the way we are actually well ahead of many countries in terms of the acceptance and the use of the vaccine and how that protects us. I think the Prime Minister can take some credit for that. Not all of it, but he can take some. And we're not going to have a general election till 2024. So I would say, steady the bus. Hold on to your courage. It's going to be okay. It's a bit rocky at the moment. It's hardly surprising. But no, I'm not worried, and I don't want to see a change of leader.
Layla Moran.
Well, what you've been expressing, George, is what I'm hearing from Conservative voters in England as well, who are lifelong Tories. And I had 3 email me today, but I met a bunch of them in Chesham. I understand there's a number of them in North Shropshire who have been talking about it today on the doors. There's a by-election there next week, of lifelong Tories who consider themselves Conservatives but do not identify with Boris Johnson. And I think there is an opportunity there for those parties who can defeat him in seats, and I think it's going to be interesting to see where this lands at the next election. But I think it's also true to say that he is toxic for the Union. Boris Johnson is the SNP's best friend, and it's interesting today that Douglas Ross and other Tory Scots have been out with their guns blazing against this today, because they can see the damage that this is going to do in the spectre of a potential another referendum, which obviously none of us want.
Would you accept, though, that all prime ministers, it doesn't really matter what their party is, goes through this. I mean, I can remember the 1980s when I would knock on doors and people would say, I'm never voting Conservative while that woman is prime minister. Tony Blair had it as well in spades. It's part of politics, and people often say, I'm never going to vote for that party again. People said they'd never vote for the Liberal Democrats again after the coalition. But gradually, you sort of build yourself up. That this is, in a wider context, nothing unusual.
Nothing unusual, although it does seem to be getting more frequent. And I think what was noticeable, even just 6 months ago, is some of that sheen was beginning to come off. I think there was a sense in 2019, let's give him a chance. There were lots of people who had, not really seen much of him. I know those of us who are just a few metres away from Westminster beggar to believe this, but, it took him being Prime Minister for people to see that sheen come off. And actually what we have here is a chancer, someone who wrote 2 essays before he decided which way he was going to go in terms of Leave and Remain. What he does is he looks at the landscape and he goes, what's the best thing for Boris Johnson? And then he picks that. And I think people don't want that. They want a leader with beliefs. And I'm sorry to say, and I really feel for those Conservative voters who feel this way, they don't identify with him. And I think that's a real danger for the party at the moment.
Adam Bienkov.
Well, the Prime Minister was asked about this, Prime Minister's questions today by SNP's Iain Blackford, and he said, I want to carry on doing the job. And he's got a large majority and he probably will carry on doing the job. There's no obvious way to get rid of him. But that's not the same as saying that there are going to be lots of people happy about that fact. And certainly a lot of Conservative MPs are starting to become quite unhappy about that fact. It was notable in the Chamber today. There was a lot of anger from Conservative MPs and more Conservative MPs speaking both privately and publicly against the Prime Minister. And some of that is being directed to other people in the government. Sajid Javid, there was calls of resign in the Chamber today, which is quite remarkable.
Not from his own side.
Yes, from his own side. From his own side.
Yeah.
Yes, which I've never heard before in the Chamber.
I'm astonished.
Yeah.
And that's not Sajid Javid's fault. He's following what he's been told to do by the Prime Minister. And I think there's a lot of kind of displacement activity from Conservative MPs here, lashing out at Sajid Javid and other members of the Cabinet and his advisors, when really it all comes down to the man in charge.
Christian Wakeford, were you shouting resign?
I wasn't in the chamber.
So you weren't, but if you had been, would you have been?
No, I wouldn't have been shouting resign to Sajid. I think in response to the actual question, I think like Adam said, there can be enough letters going in to trigger a vote or no. I think he'd survive it at the moment. I think there's still a lot of support there.
Do you know people that have written any letters?
I'm aware of reports that they've gone through. I'm not aware of anyone who's openly said that they've submitted one.
And you haven't?
Not at this moment in time, no.
But I think it's safe to say you have thought about it.
From the last couple of weeks, it's been shocking, hasn't it? But there's no way to hide behind it. It's been embarrassing. And whether that was from the Owen Paterson issue, which I may or may not have been outspoken on that one, to where we are now, why couldn't we have had the apology last week, get ahead of the story, and actually say, well, I didn't know about a party, but we'll have an investigation, we'll find out what's happened, and if it has, then there will be a discipline. To do it now, a week later, suggests that either the House was misled to then, or Number 10 is misleading the Prime Minister, and I'm not sure which is worse.
We had a caller just before Cross Question started, I don't know if you heard him, who was basically saying that it's all down to Boris Johnson's advisors, they're giving him bad advice, that the Cabinet are useless. And I said, well, maybe that is the case, but he appointed them all. The buck stops with him. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I think we could say advisors advise, but how many times have we said that ministers decide? And he is the Prime Minister, so I would hope he's the one who's making the decisions.
Do you have confidence?
So much flexibility.
You represent a very marginal seat in Bury South. What's your majority?
402.
402. Do you have confidence that Boris Johnson is the man to enable you to hold your seat at the next election?
I like to think I'm the man who will be able to help me.
Good answer. Not quite answering the question.
If it's the Boris Johnson from the last couple of weeks, I think it's going to be tough.
What would you like to see him do to change?
I think we actually need some energy. We actually just need some honesty, and if that's some of the difficult decisions that are coming forward, such as today, and I don't agree with the increased restrictions. I think there's not the evidence there to to back them at the moment, but they also don't make sense.
Well, we'll come on to that in a
but
bit.
Just so some coherency and common sense would go a long way.
And when you talk to your colleagues who may be in similar seats to yours with small majorities, do you think there is a real groundswell within the parliamentary party that agree with your analysis?
I think there's still quite a lot of loyalty from the fact that a lot of people were there because of 2019 and because of Boris Johnson. I think there's an element of the benefit of a doubt, but that again only goes so far. The last couple of weeks have been really straining that relationship, and as for yes, that trust or benefit is still there, but how long it's there is probably the main question.
West Streeting, your seat was a comparative marginal. A lot of Conservative voters. Presumably, they've been bending your ear over the past couple of weeks as well.
Yeah,
I'm thinking about George's question.
I think that's absolutely true. I think when someone tells you who they are, believe them the first time. Boris Johnson has been disciplined or sacked from every single job he has ever held for dishonesty. It is part of who he is. He's never going to change. And the thing that makes me really angry
he wasn't sacked as Mayor of London, was he?
No, he was certainly dishonest as Mayor of London. And what makes me really angry today is that his actions, the actions of people around him, have undermined public trust and confidence in the government at a serious moment in a national crisis, and is undermining confidence in public health measures, which we believe are necessary in order to deal with this new variant. And I really think Conservative MPs need to really think about whether this is the person that is fit to take us through the next phase of this crisis. And on the parties in particular, Boris Johnson has lied again and again and again. He sent out his ministers to lie on the airwaves, and you probably saw and heard.
Today, hasn't we?
No, they wouldn't go on.
But Ian,
my opposite number, Sajid Javid, the health secretary, was supposed to be doing the morning round this morning, promoting the booster campaign. Now he didn't do that. And I don't blame him for it one bit, because you know as well as I do, if he'd done any media interviews this morning, the questions would have all been about the Downing Street parties.
It wasn't his decision not to do it, it was Number 10.
Well, of course, they wouldn't want him out there, and he wouldn't be able to answer questions anyway. But this is the core point. Boris Johnson and the people around him are distracting from that public health campaign at a critical moment. And that is what I think is so grossly irresponsible, and what makes Boris Johnson different from every single one of his predecessors, Labour or Conservative. Every single one that I've known in my lifetime, none of them have been as dishonest, self-serving and frankly dangerous as this one.
Ian Blackford called for Boris Johnson to resign. I noticed Keir Starmer didn't. Should he?
Well, I think ask any Labour MP, ask any Labour member of, we want Boris Johnson to have resigned yesterday, last year, for any given reason. That's not actually the question.
What about tomorrow?
We want to happen.
Ian Blackford made a real impact in Prime Minister's questions today in a way that some are saying Keir Starmer didn't, because we can all remember.
I disagree.
Do
you know what, Ian? No, the thing is, I understand this, and that's why Ian Blackford's done it. But this is not actually about the usual knockabout in Parliament, between the political parties and the usual kind of Punch and Judy people are used to seeing at Prime Minister's questions. This is about the fact that this Prime Minister has undermined public trust and confidence in the government at a critical moment, broken his own rules at a time when families across the country made really, really big sacrifices. Of course, but will there are only two ways to get rid of Boris Johnson, because that man doesn't take responsibility. He's never taken responsibility for anything in his life. There are only two routes to this. One is for enough Conservative MPs to send in a letter and to have a leadership challenge and to remove him, which is what I think they should do immediately. The other thing, of course, is for Labour to win a general election and for the vote, and that's for the voters to decide. Just very quickly, I'm going to go back to Edwina to take up one of the points that you just made there, Wes, because Edwina, as a former health minister, you must understand that if a politician, you remember from your time over the X scandal, if a politician says something, it can completely undermine public trust in a sector. Doesn't this whole Downing Street party thing and the one rule for us, one rule for them, doesn't that undermine the message that Boris Johnson was putting out at 6 o'clock about the new restrictions? People are just going to say, well, you don't obey them, so why should I?
Well, you're making all sorts of assumptions about what the Prime Minister did or didn't do a year ago there, Ian. What I do remember is at the height of her powers, Margaret Thatcher was subject to enormous strain and stress. She had one of her cabinet members, Michael Heseltine, actually walking out. There was a huge row, immense row, with a great deal of talk behind the scenes about let's get rid of her. What perhaps I could say to Christian and some of the other Conservative backbenchers, including those shouting disgracefully at Syed Javid today, is this, that actually you're there because of Boris Johnson. The seats that someone like Christian holds, that our MP in High Peak holds, we wouldn't hold them without the superb campaigner that is Boris and the way in which he delivered on the promises made in that manifesto to deliver Brexit. That's what everyone seems to be forgetting. When it comes to the next general election, all being well, we get a fair wind, he'll be exactly the same. And like Margaret Thatcher, he'll get returned again. So all this talk about having successors, that's why Wes Streeting wants to cause so much difficulty. I understand entirely. That's his job as a brand new speaker on the front benches for Labour. Congratulate him on his new role. But the only way that Labour can win is if Boris is not the leader of the Conservative Party when it comes to the next election. And the only way that can happen right now is if backbench Tory MPs decide that they are too scared and too shaky, and there are all sorts of worse words I could use, but they're being flaky. And they shouldn't do that. We are in the middle of a crisis. It's the worst possible time to start changing leadership. We're not going to do that. We've actually got the best leader available, and I'm quite sure that we're going to come through this successfully.
That is what happened in 1995 when a lot of Conservative MPs said we're going to lose the next election if John Major is still in office. There was John Major put himself up for a leadership election. Maybe Boris Johnson should follow his lead and do that now. But of course he did stay as leader, and we all know you lost your seat after that, didn't you?
The difference, Ian, was that Labour was led by its most charismatic leader for decades. And that's not the case now.
Right. George, thank you very much for your question. We've got lots more questions to come. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
Have you
Live Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:20 here on LBC. Our panel tonight, Edwina Currie, former Health Minister, Wes Streeting, currently and just in the job, Shadow Secretary of State for Health for Labour. Adam Bienkov is Chief Westminster Correspondent for Byline Times, and Christian Wakeford is Conservative MP for Bury South, and Layla Moran is Liberal Democrat MP for Oxford West and Abingdon, and their Shadow Foreign Affairs spokeswoman. And something to do with an APG. You're head of the APG on COVID, aren't you?
On COVID, yeah.
Oh, thank goodness I got that right. Right, lots of calls coming in. Let's go to Charles in Hull. It kind of leads on from our last question. Hi, Charles.
Oh, hi, Ian. Yeah, and the panel, of course. Can a leader who's inflamed so many parts of his party carry on being disregarded, and what will it look like to the electorate?
Christian?
I think in terms of information, yes, it's been a very challenging couple of weeks, but there have been quite a few things, and I'm sure Wes and Layla will disagree, but when we've had the Nationality and Borders Bill that's gone through today, obviously small boats has been an issue that's been raised on quite a few doors across the country, and speaking to colleagues, that's coming up in pretty much every WhatsApp group almost on a daily basis. So when there are things going through that are changing and some of the beliefs that he holds, I think it's do you judge someone by their beliefs or by the actions? And I think it's the latter, which is where there's concerns at the moment. So I think the main message is probably to get your house in order.
But people kind of knew what Margaret Thatcher believed. They knew what David Cameron believed. Or Theresa May up to a point, I suppose. But people want to have an idea of what the inner beliefs of a political leader are, and that's always thrown against Keir Starmer, that no one quite knows, even though he's written a 14,000-word essay, they still don't quite know exactly where he lies on the political spectrum. That is a failing in Boris Johnson, in that he can be anything to anyone, or is that a strength?
Well, I think it's probably very, very apt in addressing the levelling up challenge. What does levelling up mean? It means nothing, which means it means everything. And until you define something, or until you define someone, then it is open to that interpretation, and that's a weakness, but it's a strength at the same time, because I guess it means you're very pragmatic and able to, well, I guess, turn with the tide. I would much rather have a defined person but a flexible policy, and for me it always comes down to education.
Wes?
I mean, this is the remarkable thing about Boris Johnson, and you mentioned earlier his time as Mayor of London. I mean, he's a sort of political chameleon in that sense. As Mayor of London, he won what is a very Labour-leaning city by being a very liberal Mayor of London. He was calling for earned amnesty for illegal migrants. He was
something he still believes
very
in,
big on equalities. He seemed to be culturally at home with London. And as Prime Minister, he seems to have become a much more kind of right-wing populist Prime Minister in the tradition of other kind of successful Conservative politicians across Europe and North America. And I wouldn't put him quite as far as Donald Trump on the populist spectrum, but he definitely leaned into that style of politics when Trump was on the scene, and Boris Johnson thought that kind of politics would work for him. And in the end, you get found out. And I think that's what's really happened to Boris Johnson the last couple of weeks. He's just been found out. And I don't know, I mean, it might come off in questions shortly, but when I watched Allegra Stratton, the Prime Minister's now former spokesperson, in floods of tears on television earlier, resigning, apologising, accepting that what she'd done was wrong, understanding the pain she caused, there's no doubt anyone watching that, whether they felt sympathy or not for her, there's no doubt anyone watching her would think, well, that's a genuine apology and a half, and she's taken responsibility.
I agree with you, but there are quite a few people who don't believe that was genuine.
Well, all I'd say is, when's Boris Johnson going to start taking responsibility? Because we can blame Allegra Stratton, we can blame Gavin Williamson for his office party, we can blame everyone around the Prime Minister and say, oh, it's all the advisors. But in the end, the culture is set by the Prime Minister. The standards are upheld by the Prime Minister, or not in this case. So in the end, I think people are seeing with Boris Johnson that he doesn't conduct himself in the way that any
What
political
about
leader
the
should. And
question
he's
from
been found
Charles?
out.
I mean, he's basically saying, can a leader with no internal beliefs ever lead well? And the accusation is that can be thrown against Boris Johnson for that, but it can also be thrown against Keir Starmer because...
I strongly disagree, and I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. I mean, it's not just saying, I disagree, he's my leader, and I've been in the job for a week, don't want to get sacked for disagreeing with that. No, there's a serious point here. If I was going to sum up, I don't need like a lot of words to sum up Keir Starmer, I just need one word, which is justice. Keir Starmer, for his entire life, has fought for justice as Director of Public Prosecutions, but also as a lawyer in the earlier part of his career, standing up for people who'd been denied access to justice, often against very big, powerful vested interests. And that belief in justice doesn't just apply to the law, it applies to the way that our country is run, the way the economy works, social justice.
Why hasn't he been able to convince people that, or really even explain that? Because I've never heard him talk in those terms. I mean, I think you're probably right.
His conference speech absolutely did that. All I'd say, and we're not complacent about this. Keir is definitely not complacent about this. And one of his strengths as a leader of the opposition is he doesn't look at polls and feedback through rose-tinted glasses. And he doesn't look at the polls and think, oh, we put our feet up now, we'll cruise to victory at the next general election. He's constantly thinking about this and working at it. A big part of his initial leadership was dominated by the pandemic. People didn't want to hear party political knockabout in that time. Space has opened up since for us to talk about a wider range of issues. And I thought at the Labour Party conference, he did set out his stall in a number of ways about who he is, what he stands for, how he wants to govern the country. And of course, it's the job of all of us in the shadow cabinet, and he's just shaking it up and put some new people in and giving people different responsibilities. It's our job to kind of double down on that and make sure people understand with the Labour Party who they would be putting in number 10 and what we would be delivering as a Labour government. Because I think when you can contrast Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson, the way they conduct themselves, the way they have conducted themselves throughout their entire public life, there is no competition.
Adam?
I think Boris Johnson's been one of the most well-known figures in politics for a long time, but I think public's perception of him has been quite...
You've covered him for a long time.
Yes.
You covered him in London a lot, didn't you?
Yes, from his first campaign in London, I think, which Wes campaigned on as well. But I think people's knowledge of him and understanding of him has been quite superficial. And I think a lot of that is down to the fact that he has this kind of chameleon positions, and he's never really committed to one ideology or another. But I think that kind of lack of principle is starting to come across in a negative way for him now. And certainly in the last few weeks and months, people are starting to see another side to him that they haven't seen, both within his own party, but I think in the public as well.
Do you think that Labour have consistently underestimated Boris Johnson, right from his first mayoral campaign, when Ken Livingstone certainly did, and the second one, and then in 2019? I'm never sure that the Labour Party has understood the appeal of Boris Johnson, therefore they become complacent about it.
Yes, I think in the initial sort of campaign when he first ran for Mayor of London, he was Labour's first line of attack, I think, was he's a clown, he's a joke. But that didn't really matter back then because people saw that he was a big personality and they liked that personality. And that's been the one thing that has carried him through, that he's had this kind of obedient personality. That as well, I think, has started to fade. I think that's a lot of that shine. And you saw him at the press conference today, and a lot of his recent public appearances, he just doesn't seem to be enjoying the job in the way that he used to. And I think a lot of that shine has started to come off the Prime Minister.
I'm not sure, actually, he's ever enjoyed the job. And there are a lot of people who think he'll enjoy being ex-Prime Minister more than he enjoys being Prime Minister. Edwina?
Well, the fact that both your main questions have been about Boris and the description that Adam
we're not finished yet.
Yeah, I know. That points to an incontrovertible fact, which is the dominant figure in British politics in recent years has been Boris Johnson, whoever was the Prime Minister. And that's because he's got a quality called charisma. We don't even have an English word for it. What we do know about him, and what we know about him both from London and from his time in the role here, is that he does believe in freedom. He was very reluctant to go into any form of lockdown. He is a natural bouncing optimist, which can be difficult if you're ruling the country in the middle of a killer plague, global plague. He's found that, I think, extremely difficult, as we all have. We know that he chafes against rules. Well, all good Tories chafe against rules. It's only the Labour Party that like lots of rules, and the Lib Dems. But most good Tories are natural freedom-loving, independent and individualists. And Boris is absolutely all of that. Now, if you add to that a dose of substantial pragmatism, and an awareness, an almost uncanny awareness often, of how swing voters are thinking and what they feel, so that he was able to pick up, for example, let me put it like this, Wes, that if the Labour Party has a leader that's interested in justice and equal rights and so on, fine, all well and good. But actually, in the terraces of Burnley and Bradford and the High Peak and so on, there's an awful lot of voters that were much more interested in jobs and wages. They were anxious about immigration. They got fed up being called bigots by a Labour Prime Minister. Not this one, but, previous ones. In fact, the last Labour Prime Minister, as I recall, quite a long time ago.
Yeah, but Edwina, you said a lot of things there, which many people will agree with. But you haven't actually told us anything that he actually believes, which was what Charles was really alluding to. He's got no internal belief system.
Well, it doesn't follow that that's absolutely necessary. I'm not sure I have an internal belief system, but I have qualities of character and ways of reacting to events and ways of thinking through events. And perhaps one thing that I hope I have that perhaps Boris could develop a little bit more would be a way of anticipating events and taking steps in order to avoid trouble. He's not very good at doing that. But since when do we have to have people with this extraordinary internal belief system? How about actually listening to the voters, which is what the Labour Party hasn't done? How about actually listening to what the voters are concerned about and trying to ensure that their lives in future are better and stronger, particularly up north where I am, and that other issues that are of great concern, like the green issues, are also taken into account and put into operation in the teeth of opposition from all sorts of people. We're not getting a great deal of support of that in the House of Commons, are we?
George on Twitter says, Edwina clearly thinks that Boris Johnson has that eggs factor.
Oh dear.
Boom, boom.
Yeah. Oh dear.
That's the best bit of humour we're likely to get on this programme today. Probably. You never know, though. There's still half an hour to go. Have we heard from Layla? Says my producer. I do apologise.
Right.
Let's hear from Layla.
Well, what does it mean to lead is probably worth a half-hour conversation in of itself. But when I speak to people who aren't party political, which is most people, I think what they want from a prime minister, as opposed to, the entertainer Boris Johnson, the have I got news for you guy who shows up, you can imagine having a pint with.
You've been on that.
I have indeed. Yeah. And it was very enjoyable. But what they want from a prime minister is someone who's going to put them first, put the country first, and take difficult decisions. And I think the problem that Boris Johnson has, and I would actually very much agree with Edwina, he is the conversation. But recently, it's not been in a good way. And when I speak to voters who would classically vote Conservative, who are liberty-loving, well, this is a Prime Minister who has brought in vaccine passports today. This is a Conservative who is raising taxes. It's very interesting to see how this is playing with not any sort of extreme base, but actually that core vote that the Conservatives have. And I think at some point, he is going to have to show where his beliefs are, because he's going to have to choose what kind of Conservative Party he's going to leave. And if it's one that's left in his image, that's going to lead. No, leave, because one day he's...
Okay. I see what you mean.
One day this will be over. And the only thing I can think sometimes is one day there will be no more Boris Johnson, but the Conservative Party is going to be recast in his image. And at the moment, it's quite hard to see what that's going to look like. And I dare say, for the Liberal Democrats, that is a huge opportunity, because in places like the Blue Wall in the southeast, or indeed in places in the Blue Wall in places like North Shropshire,
I knew you were going to say that.
I just dare say it this week. We're doing rather well. And the reason we're doing rather well is because they see a principled fur to have over Boris Johnson's Conservatives.
Thank you all for that. Apologies that I've nearly missed you out. It's having five panellists. It's confused me. It's 8:34 on LBC. Let's get the news headlines from Zora Suleiman.
The Met Police say it will not investigate allegations of a party at Downing Street based on footage of Number 10 aides joking about it. However, they did say they will look into internal investigations carried out by the Cabinet Secretary if necessary. The Prime Minister has denied he announced tougher COVID restrictions as a distraction over allegations of that Christmas party. Boris Johnson has tonight announced that he'll bring in Plan B COVID measures for England, encouraging people to work from home when necessary. and face coverings mandatory in public venues. And British cyclist Mark Cavendish has been assaulted by 4 armed men at his home in Essex. His wife and 2 children were also threatened at knife point. LBC weather mostly dry for the south and east of Scotland and the south of England, with some clear spells as well. Rain clearing Northern Ireland but continuing over Wales, central England and the far northeast. A high of 1 degree.
LBC. You're Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:38 with us for this hour. Layla, Moran, Christian Wakeford, Ada Bienkov, Wes Streeting and Edwina Currie. I have to ask, Edwina, is that your I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here red gilet that you're wearing?
It isn't, but it's very similar. How nice!
Look, I know. Well, you see, Wes is an absolute fan, so he noticed that. Right, let's go to our next caller. It's the lovely Gemma in Leeds. Hello, Gemma.
Hello. So,
what would you like to ask?
Okay, so with the Matt Hancock affair, the botched Afghanistan withdrawal, the Owen Paterson sleaze situation, and the cancelling of HS2 Leeds, and now this, have the British voters lost all faith in Boris and this government?
Wes Streeting, I'm sure you'll want to say not at all.
In some ways, Gemma, I mean, you tell me, and it's ultimately it's up to you, the listeners, you, the voters, about who runs this country. And I'm glad you mentioned, because it's not just about who's had a party during lockdown last year. I genuinely think that the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the way it was handled, and the fact that the Foreign Secretary at the time was lounging around on a sun lounger while British troops were putting themselves in danger to rescue people in the most unimaginable circumstances. The fact that the permanent secretary of the Foreign Office was apparently on holiday and didn't return until ages after. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about the culture and standard that's set in public life. And it is dangerous. I think that's the point I really want to get across. These actions, this culture led by Boris Johnson, is having real life consequences. We saw it in the nature of the Afghanistan withdrawal. We're seeing it now undermining public confidence in public health measures, which I believe, and the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor believes, are essential for public health. And so I hope people see Boris Johnson for what he is. I hope people are asking themselves how this can go on. I hope people with Conservative MPs are writing in to try and effect a change and to say this isn't good enough, particularly those of you who are Conservative voters, who I've no doubt are sort of pulling your hair out about this, because this country deserves better than this. We deserve better leadership than this. And I don't think Boris Johnson will ever be able to provide it.
Sure, that was a slogan under Ed Miliband, wasn't it? Layla?
I hope that people are starting to see through this, although it's not always immediately seen in the polls. And I think that's one of the things that, you sort of bang your head against the table, like, why is he still holding up? And I think some of that resilience we were talking about earlier is part of it. But the consequences of this government are immense. I've got constituents who are Afghans. They are an ethnic minority group who are persecuted in Afghanistan. Some of them worked for the government, and they are still 100 days later waiting for that resettlement scheme to open. And Christian, you mentioned the small boats earlier, and people were talking about it. There was an Afghan soldier on one of those boats. The consequences of this government's actions...
people died.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And the consequences of this government actions has meant that people that we were meant to be saving weren't saved, and we owe them an incredible debt. And it's today that we passed a bill that basically doubled down on this idea that those people are bad people, when in fact they are amazing people, and we were the ones who let them down. And I'm hoping that people are starting to see through this. We talk about Dominic Raab. The other thing he did was 10 days later, apparently he had 50 of his constituency members to Chevening. There's no suggestion of any sort of impropriety in that, only that there was an enormous crisis happening. In my constituency office alone, we were dealing with 400 Afghans. Our emails weren't being answered. And we've had 2 whistleblowers now, one who's left the department, but one still in it, who have described what it was like. Why was he entertaining them? And we know why, because the Lib Dems are very close second in his seat, and he needs to fundraise for an organiser, and that's why he was doing it. But why on earth was he not doing his core job? And it's important to note that it's not just him. You look across the cabinet table and you ask who picks them, and it's Boris Johnson, and that's why it matters.
Yeah.
Christian?
I think when we look at... there's a lot of different issues there. When we look at Afghanistan, I don't necessarily blame I blame the Americans for putting us in the position in the first place. However, our initial reaction was poor. It was very, very poor. Ben Wallace, bless him, the calls he was putting into members of all parties, and you could see the emotion in his face and what it actually meant to him. That was what leadership was in the process.
Why was it lacking in the Foreign Secretary at the time then?
Oh, he wasn't there, was he? It was a poor decision, I think, to go on holiday, to try and cover it up, and some of the excuses of I couldn't be in the sea because it was closed. I think when we're talking about a lot of these issues, it's not necessarily the issue, it's how we've actually dealt with it, and the communication has been so poor. But I think, to quote, a blind man on a fast horse could see some of these coming from a mile away, but we walked openly into them, and that's not good.
There have been calls from Labour this week for him to resign, and when you look at his statement on the Downing Street party, where he said, well, the police don't investigate retrospectively.
Oh, that was just
Do you think
painful.
this man is the Justice Secretary? He's a lawyer. He's actually a very talented lawyer. Doesn't he know the law?
I mean, for me, I think the most painful thing from this hasn't been the dribs of more of a story coming out. It's just been everyone lining up to say how guidance has been adhered to. It's, well, if it has, then there's been no party. If there was a party, then it wasn't followed. And it just took me back to Dominic Cummings all over again, where everyone lined up. You've
been really honest and open tonight in a way that I think a lot of people listening to this programme would not have expected a Conservative MP to be. Why can you do this and why can't your colleagues?
Well, I think for me, it's what's right and what's wrong, and the last week has been wrong. It's that simple.
Okay, Edwina?
No, it's not that simple, Christian, because if you think something is wrong, you have to come up with some solutions. And the problem with some of the issues that are prevalent in this question is that all the solutions were deeply unpalatable. If you look at Afghanistan, for example, nobody was expecting anything to happen that fast, including the Taliban.
Rubbish.
That's not rubbish.
That's rubbish. I'm sorry, Edwina. That's rubbish. And
rubbish.
I know that's a line we want to believe, but I'm afraid to say I'm not shouting down. I'm being quite calm.
If you don't mind, I will answer the question the way that I wish to answer it. Even the Taliban did not expect that they were going to be able to sweep through into Kabul in a matter of days. And nobody was prepared for that. The Germans weren't prepared for it. The Americans weren't prepared for it. We certainly weren't prepared for it. But we managed to get 15,000 people out. That actually does require some recognition. And Christian's mentioned Ben Wallace, who I think deserves a lot of credit, and the various members of the armed forces who did that. That said, what would you have us do? Stay in Afghanistan? Really? I don't think so. I don't think the British people wanted us to stay in Afghanistan for a moment longer. And that has now been done and has been finished. Okay, let me go on to the public health issue, which was raised in the question and hasn't been addressed yet, because that's more my field. If anybody seriously thinks and is thinking to themselves that they're not going to obey any new rules, and they're not going to obey Plan B because there might or might not have been a party in Downing Street, the only person they're disadvantaging is themselves. Because the public health rules are there for our benefit and for our good, and we should be obeying them in our own interest and in the interest of those that are close to us. And if we allow politics to get in the way of that, and Wes Streeting has, I think, already tweeted that you will support the Plan B arrangements. I think that's incredibly wise and sensible. If we let politics get in the way of that, we just end up with more dead people and more people in hospital.
Very quickly, Wes.
I just say, though, it's not politics that's getting in the way of public health. It's the Prime Minister.
Okay, Adam?
To answer Gemma's question, has the public had enough? I think it's undoubtedly the case if you look at the polls that the Conservatives have taken a big hit, especially since the summer, but in recent weeks particularly. But what we're not seeing so far is that although people are turning away from the Conservative Party and they're turning away from Boris Johnson, his approval ratings are at historic lows for him, they're not yet turning towards the Labour Party, and the Labour Party aren't seeing the sort of leads that you might expect at this stage in the government. And my question to Wes would be why we aren't seeing that yet? Why Keir Starmer isn't going ahead in the way that you might expect?
I'm going to leave that as an open question for the moment because we're running a little bit late. We'll take more of your calls, and we've got a question that isn't on anything to do with Boris Johnson. Well, it sort of is, but not directly. 8:48.
This is LBC. If you're a Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:51. Jeff in Ipswich has texted in to say, West Streeting, didn't he get told off by the Speaker today? If he thinks he should be on the front bench, he should behave. Quite right, you're a bully, West Streeting. For the second week running, I believe.
Naughty.
No, to be honest, I did shout at the Prime Minister earlier.
You let yourself down, you let your party down.
No, do you know, and
I'm not
funny,
angry, I'm just disappointed.
honestly, honestly, before I became an MP, I used to watch PMQs and like everyone else would be like, oh, I can't believe they behave like that. You know, wouldn't let kids in school behave like that. I'd never be one of those people, and he's got under my skin. It was. I don't want to rehearse all the ground we've already gone over this evening, but I don't think the Prime Minister, until today, properly understood the depth.
What did you shout?
Genuine strength of
what
feeling.
What were you shouting?
I can't remember. It was nothing obscene. I think it was, it was just basically saying, no one believes you. I think that was it. I was saying nobody believes you over and over again, because his mouth was moving and everything coming out of it was just lies.
And when the Speaker does that and says, oi, you can't be, if you want to be on the front bench, you can't say things like that. Did you feel a little bit like a naughty schoolboy?
I don't like getting told off. I was always sick of your two shoes at school. But I must say, I had loads of nice emails from my constituents saying we were shouting at the telly, we were so proud of you. I'm not sure that's going to be a universal reaction. I'm now going to get the wave of others now saying, behave yourself.
Edwina, when you were in Parliament, I can imagine you shouting a few things at Neil Kinnock.
No. Neil Kinnock wasn't the Prime Minister.
No, but he was.
I bet you
still shouted at him, though.
No, I used to get shouted at, especially when I was at the dispatch box. But I remember getting my own back on Neil Kinnock by pointing out to him that he wasn't the boss in the Kinnock household, that he was being led by the nose by Mrs. Kinnock. Everyone
how sexist of you.
Got very, very cross at that.
I can well imagine. Right, enough of this hilarity. Let's go to Will in Harrogate, who has a very serious question. Hello, Will.
Hi, Ian. Thank you for taking my call. The question is, the government have recently announced new policies to tackle middle-class drug users. How are the policies going to differentiate between the working and the middle classes?
Layla, you're middle class.
Yeah, I guess I am. Working class dad who made good, and therefore I'm middle class, so that's fine. I accept that. I guess my accent's quite plummy, so they must have an accent-ometer that they'll measure people by. I mean, this must be in all seriousness, this is an impossible policy. I guess what they're talking about here is they're targeting drugs that middle-class people like. For example, allegations of people on the parliamentary estate taking large amounts of cocaine have been found in various parts of the estate. But actually, I'm pleased that the Speaker is taking that quite seriously. I think it's important that if there is a culture of that, it is dealt with. But I think the broader picture here is that I'm not sure that what the government's going to do is going to work, because they keep talking about crackdowns, they keep talking about we need to punish the gangs, yes, true, and they talk a little bit about rehabilitation, but actually when you look at what support is there for people who have drug problems, I don't think they've got the right approach, and I think we need a public health approach to drugs, and that's the Liberal Democrat view, is that if you treat particularly persistent drug users rather than recreational drug use, I don't love that term, but if you treat people with drug problems as people who are ill first, then you get much better outcomes in the longer term. And some of that will mean quite difficult decisions, like, for example, allowing consumption rooms, which is one of the things that I do think we need to do in this country.
That'll go down well in the Dog and Duck in Oxford.
I think it would actually, because evidence shows that this helps. And fundamentally, it's now been, I'm 39. All I can ever remember from the age dot is people saying, don't do drugs, yes, but actually the problem has got worse and worse and worse. We need a change of approach. There are other countries that are trialling this change of approach, so we don't have to jump first and we don't have to do it all. But I do think a change of approach is needed, and I'm not sure what the government's suggesting is going to work.
Now, looking at the time, I'm going to ask you all to be relatively brief here, if you can. Adam.
I think the reality of how drugs policy is enforced and how it differentiates between working class and middle class people is that if you're working class, if you're from a deprived background or a BME background, you're overwhelmingly more likely to be prosecuted for the same drug offences that that are committed by people who are middle class. And I think, you know, you're saying that will go down well in dog and duck, but actually the public are well ahead of most politicians on this issue. And polling has consistently shown that people favour a more relaxed approach to drug enforcement and to liberalising the laws on drugs. And that's just not something that either the government or the opposition are really pushing forward at the moment.
That's an interesting point. When the announcement came, was it on Sunday or was it Monday on the front page of The Sun, and it was all about war on drugs? I was thinking, a war on drugs has never, ever been won. Isn't it about time we just change the laws to reflect modern society? And modern society is one in which people from all classes, working class, middle class, upper class, take drugs more than they did. Don't we need to recognise that, Christian?
I think it's certainly about time we have that conversation, and we need a wider conversation about alcohol as well. Mm-hmm. And I find myself in a very unusual position. I agree with Layla. Now we're talking about rehabilitation, treatment services, and it's lacking. I mean, I lost my own brother to alcohol addiction, so it's as the chairman for the APPG on alcohol harm, it's something I'm passionate about. But the stigma of addiction is what we need to overcome first. And we can go a long way very quickly by removing the Memorandum of Exclusion on the Equality Act that says if you're an addict, it's your choice, therefore you're not a protected characteristic. I'm sorry, no one chooses to be an addict. So I think it's right that we're actually having these conversations and trying to tackle it, but I think we need to look a bit more holistically at it and find a solution.
And Wes, should this not be a public health issue, not a Home Office issue? Because drug laws come under the Home Office, but actually it's hospitals, it's the health service that is at the sharp end of this.
Yeah, it's got to be a bit of both, to be honest. I think there are lots of people who have addiction and dependency issues, and I think we've got to treat people, help people, get them off drugs. I do think, though, that we still got to deal with this on a criminal issue, and I think there is an issue of equity in that, bluntly, members of the cabinet who've taken coke have said so on air. And are able to do so with a kind of impunity that wouldn't exist if they were a 18-year-old black kid from North London. That's the difference. But that's the difference. It is the inequality between those at the top and everybody else, particularly if you're poorer and working class. There is that inequality, but that doesn't mean you kind of just liberalise all the drug laws. Frankly, there are a whole bunch of people in this country who, as far as I'm concerned, crossed a line and deserve everything that's coming to them when it comes to tougher sentences and drug laws when they decided to use children to ferry drugs across the country. They are no better than people who exploit children for sex and groom them in that way. They are grooming these children as drug runners. It has a huge impact on their lives. There should be tougher sentences to those people. So, by all means, drug users, public health approach, I could get behind that. But drug dealers, organised crime, we've got to deal with it. This is not just a national issue, this is a global issue. And recreational middle-class drug users who shove coke up their nose every week thinking they're doing no harm are actually funding that organised international crime. And who knows, the person who got the coke to their dealer may well have been a 13-year-old kid running county lines up and down the country, and they should think about that and think about the consequence of their actions.
Well, I hope our digital team clipped that as a clip for the internet, because I think everyone I saw Edwina nodding. I think everyone would agree with you on that. Edwina, I've got to ask you to be very brief, please.
Yeah, I think at least part of this is an education issue. Middle-class people who think that they're not addicted, middle-class people who provide the money and who use the drugs as they see recreationally, are actually funding the addiction of other people and are causing a great deal of the problems. And we have to get through to people who think, I'm not causing a problem, I'm not having a problem, I can go to work, I'm fine, I'm all in control. Yeah, you may be, but what you are using is part of the drugs trade, and that is what is the problem.
Quick final text. Jared in Bolsover says, Edwina was a star of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. Who on the panel would get on best with a Bush Tucker trial?
Wes. No.
Christian says Wes.
I was about to say no way with another word in the middle. Do you know, I take my hat off to you, Edwina. I think anyone who goes on I'm a Celebrity, I take my hat off to you, because that is the one thing that would put me off going in. I could do the isolation, I could do being stuck with people that I don't necessarily like or come from different backgrounds. Those Bush Tucker trials are disgusting, and there's no
Eating the
way
spiders.
I'd be putting kangaroo balls or anything else like that in my mouth. Thank you very much.
That's a revelation. Adam, who do you think on the panel would get on best?
I think after his experiences in the last few weeks, I think Christian is probably the most likely to suffer more torture.
Layla?
I don't know. I don't know you all well enough yet, but you all are very resilient people. How about you, Ian? Would you do it?
To do the programme or was Chuck a try?
I think
You'd be like the voice of calm.
Unlike Edwina, I'm not a celebrity. So
Stop doing yourself down, Ian. That's our job.
Come on, Edwina, tell us what the experience was like. Did you eat a kangaroo's penis?
I was extremely lucky not to have to eat anything I didn't want to eat. But I have to tell you, it was nowhere near as hard as winning Celebrity Mastermind twice.
Oh,
what a show off. She got that in there at the end.
Fair enough.
Or what about Celebrity Pointless? Have you ever won that, Edwina? Because a certain person on this panel has.
Yes,
I've been a pointless answer.
Yeah,
Have you?
So pointless, I wasn't even on the board.
Sorry, Edwina, quickly.
I have played it twice. Once hasn't been shown yet, so I can't tell you the result of that. But I was in a team with Diane Abbott, and yes, we did win.
Well, there you go.
Oh, well.
I imagine you are... No, I better not say
That's
that.
a nice cross-party note to end on.
Wasn't it? Well, thank you all very much. I think it has kind of worked with 5 people on the panel. We won't do this regularly because it does constrict answers sometimes, but thank you all very much. I think it's really worked well tonight. Edwina Currie, Wes Streeting, Christian Wakeford, Layla Moran and Adam Bienkov. We'll be back with Cross Question next Monday at 8, but don't go anywhere because we're going to take more of your calls on today's developments, both on the Downing Street Party, what Boris Johnson said at PMQs, and also the new restrictions which he announced later this evening. Did I hear a dead cat landing on the table? 0345 6060 973. It's 3 minutes past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the Met Police say it will not investigate allegations of a Downing Street party based on footage